2 stories. One day I must be going insane. No, but honestly I'm just bored at this point. As always, the stories are not mine. Author will be in the description and I hope you enjoy. Midoriya stood at the side of his working table and was frozen in his place. He held a scalpel in gloved hands, his black hoodie on his favorite desk chair, black flu mask over his mouth and nose. He was supposed to be ready. He trembled as he stared down at the corpse laying on his experimentation table. There was a deep and jagged gash at the center of its face that likely led to a rather painful death. The blade in the little villain's hand was held close to his own chest, too shaken to begin the work he told himself he had been looking forward to. He wasn't even the one that killed this man, and yet his anxiety was going out of control. If it makes you feel better, these things weren't good people when they were alive, Shigaraki said as he sat on Midoriya's desk behind him. His right leg was over the left and he had his arms folded, no hand covering his face. Seeing his complexion was becoming very normal by now. I hate normal people. But I hate some more than others, he said casually. He slowly got up and stretched. I can see you shaking. What are you so scared of? He walked up beside him and bent down a bit to look at this freckled villain at more eye level. He kept his tone calm and almost uncharacteristically soft. He wasn't pressuring him to rush or hounding him for not being ready, even though he's been studying non-stop for more than a month. Was he always this patient? I don't know, Midoriya mumbled. He stabbed a hero in the eye, but that was technically an accident. But he started laughing about it. Was it out of hysteria? Was he worried about what that beautiful boy would think of him if he went through with this? What his mother would think? He's been sneaking out so much, he hardly saw her anymore. Was he nervous about disappointing Shigaraki and Kurogiri? Was he that afraid of messing up? What was there to mess up? He wasn't the one that killed the corpse in front of him. He hasn't even committed murder yet. Why did he feel so pathetic? His free hand began to lightly scratch at his wrist, but Shigaraki took his wrist and lightly pulled it away. A hypocrite. Don't think about it, he told him, standing up a bit straighter again and leaned back in his place. He was just gazing up at the ceiling looking rather bored, but that was his usual expression. The boy next to him could tell he was just thinking of the right thing to say. Be curious. Give yourself a chance. Then Shigaraki put his hand in the fluffy green mess that was the freckled boy's hair and ruffled it up with a finger raised. He could never be too careful. Midoriya shut his eyes tight from the pressure being pushed down on his head. It wasn't too harsh. It was rather playful actually. But the boy did listen, and when the brotherly assault ended, he pushed his hair out of his face to look at the scalpel in his hand. Give himself a chance. Shigaraki patted his shoulder before walking past him to the other side of the laboratories and lightly kicked a large furnace. Burn it when you're done. You wouldn't like the smell if we just left it here. And we can't just toss them out. They would be very likely to get caught if they just tossed them around the city. And with those last instructions, Shigaraki walked past the little villain one more time, lightly nudging his freckled cheeks with his thumb and index finger on the way, and returning to the elevator to go back up to the central area of Kurogiri's bar. Thus, leaving Midoriya all by himself with a dead body on his table. Midoriya would remain still for at least a few minutes more. The room was completely silent. What was he waiting for? There was no messing up. Be curious. And with a twisted curiosity, he began examining the corpse before doing anything more. It was stone cold, the color was drained from the skin, and there were no broken bones or fractures to be found. He began poking and feeling at it carefully. It was an adult male with faint remnants of fish scales on his neck. Hybrid transformation quirk, a type of scaly defense. He muttered to himself, going to his desk to retrieve a different notebook as he began to sketch the corpse out on paper and take notes beside the drawing. Then he tried stabbing the scales on the neck with a knife, only to see that it would not penetrate. So instead he took out a different knife and sliced off a large chunk of flesh from the corpse's bicep with a motion that can only be compared to a butcher carving meat. The teenager held the bloodied piece of skin, muscle, and tissue in his hands and began to lightly peel at the top layer of flesh to find scales hiding underneath. Curious. Curious. He wanted to know so much more. Would scales appear as an instinctive reaction to conflict, or were they summoned voluntarily? How were they summoned? What parts of the body controlled them? What were they made of? How did the body produce them? What would happen if they broke? Many questions he had could only be answered if this corpse was alive. So he could only work with what he had. And yet he wouldn't complain. His thirst for knowledge was taking over once again. He was no longer a fanboy gushing over the mysteries and limits of quirks. Now he was dissecting them and taking notes on his own work. This was his own work. His impact would be grounded in his intelligence and knowledge of quirks. There was no fear anymore. There was not a hint of hesitation. Though he was extremely delicate and careful, using a steady hand to poke and slice without a quiver. His eyes seemed to have that ominous glow as they narrowed in complete focus, constantly switching from investigating to note-taking naturally. This is what Shigaraki was letting him become. Shigaraki and Kurogiri did so much for him to finally reach this step of actually being useful. He wanted to make them proud. After many hours of non-stop work, the furnace door was slammed shut after the corpse was moved from the experimenting table to a table on wheels and then slid into the flames to burn up into ash. Once the corpse itself was taken care of, Midoriya responsibly cleaned and sterilized all of his tools. He returned all chemicals to their proper cabinets. He scrubbed the floors of any fluids or remains that may have fallen. It felt so casual now. His energy had skyrocketed from the sheer excitement of taking what he had learned from studying and using it himself and then making his own discoveries. Behind his mask, he had a childish grin filled with pride as he cleaned up his laboratories. Being productive. Making an impact. This feeling was amazing. Once all had been tidied up to his satisfaction, Midoriya had cleaned himself off to the best of his ability. His hands were mostly clean thanks to his gloves. But the same could not be said to his hoodie that was excessively stained after hours of sifting through a human body. There wasn't much he could do about it, but it was best not to wear it home for his mother to see. His mother. She has been so silent all this time. She would greet him every late morning, cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. She was fully aware that he had been sneaking out at night and coming back at the break of dawn. And yet she has done nothing because he never returned hurt, suspicious, or with anyone. When he came back, he simply looked tired but not miserable. Surely she could ask. She likely would at some point. Perhaps she's been keeping a distance due to all the intense studying he's been doing at home. How much of a blessing she has been this whole time. It would break her heart if she ever found out what he's been up to, especially now that he's gone this far for Shigaraki. How disappointed she'd be. But Midoriya shook his head furiously at the thought, even slapping the water flowing out of the sink in a small fit. How disappointed she'd be. It wasn't her fault that he didn't have a quirk. He would never blame her. But she, too, had no faith in his ability to be something big, a great and shining hero. But that beautiful boy at the school did. This was for him. This was to save him from his father. This was to bring him closer. To bring him here with Kurogiri and Shigaraki. They'd take good care of that boy here just like they've done for this green-haired mess Shigaraki found on the street in the middle of the night. And to have someone like that here all the time with him. Midoriya found himself blushing and splashed water into his face, scrubbing aggressively hard into his skin. That guy. He looked down at the water pooling in the sink and shifting between dark shades of red and then fading into pink. He never put much thought into it and denied all of Shigaraki's childish teasing, and yet he couldn't help but question a part of himself. He's never really thought of boys to be beautiful before. But he's also never had any friends to think of as beautiful either. The closest thing he had to a friend. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a last chance dive off the roof. That wretched voice echoed in his head, his eyes scrunched tightly. No, Bakugo could not compare to someone like that red and white-haired boy he met. Even if it was just for an hour or two, it was all he needed to make his chest start to feel fuzzy. This was something he's never felt before. His arms holding him at his waist. Saving him. The arm around him to hold him close. Bringing him down safely even though he was hurting too. Empathizing with him even though his pain probably couldn't compare to that of those burns on his arms. And that burn on his face, He must have been through more than he could have told him that day. But the tone of his voice, the cold bitterness with the burning hatred in his eyes and the softness yet the toned shape of his face. That guy. He was so pretty, he mumbled to himself as he then found himself holding his own waist, reminiscing over that feeling of almost falling off the roof. He wanted to be held like that one more time. 2 more times. No, dozens of times. Midoriya's cheeks blushed as he held himself, his knees turning inwards as his head tilted. His eyes had that familiar glow as a terrible smile grew on his freckled face. Splotches of blood littered his clothes and a single strand of spatter remained on the skin next to his lips. I think I really want him, he nearly giggled in the dim light of his laboratories. The elevator doors would eventually open to the main hub of Kurogiri's bar with Midoriya coming through to take a seat in his usual seat next to Shigaraki. Well, someone looks happy, Kurogiri commented as the boy had that same smile plastered on his face and shoved his notebook forward to the dark fog man. It was incredible. I was able to learn more from that than I have all week, he said ecstatically. Letting Kurogiri take the notebook, Midoriya watched him turn quite a few pages to look over the information he had taken from one subject. The freckled villain kicked his feet, leaning forward, and gripping the fabric on his knees with a kind of cute excitement. But he still never got all the blood off his face and hoodie. It was some twisted version of a child showing his dad what he drew in class today. Noticing the few spots of blood on Midoriya's face, Shigaraki was on his phone and eventually licked his thumb to smear away the spots. Couldn't have him going outside looking like that and getting caught. But the action made the boy lean back in protest and turn his face to try and get away without too much effort. Gross, he whined. But Shigaraki poked his forehead instead just enough to almost make him fall off, but didn't of course. You're gross, he retorted monotoned. Well, you're gross, Midoriya said right back but couldn't keep a straight face about it and started snickering. Seeing how happy he was now compared to when he was left with a corpse, Shigaraki was able to take a calm deep breath. He's been adjusting so well so far. These are very impressive, Kurogiri eventually said, handing the notes to Shigaraki to look over. The scrawny villain took them and silently looked over them with a frozen expression. He looked focused but he was taking this very seriously. Reading each word carefully, looking over each drawing, each label, one could only wonder if he comprehended what was written. There were lots of medical terms only someone like Midoriya would know at this point. Though the killer next to him was childish, he was nowhere near stupid. But anxiety began to well up in the young villain's chest because he couldn't tell what the older one was thinking. He was completely stone-faced. At least until he smirked with a slight scoff and lowered the notebook. Give me a day to get you the computer stuff to type these out with the drawings. Then you can send it to me, he said, sliding the notebook to the little villain. Was that it? The fact he was willing to set him up with access to a neater setup was an honor, but his face was about to look mildly disappointed when he felt a hand with only 4 fingers on his head and lightly pet him side to side. You're going to be one of the greatest villains at this rate, he praised Midoriya. Those words made the teenager freeze as his head was lightly being swayed left to right. Shigaraki paid him no mind and let him have his little moment, even ignoring the single tear that escaped his eye. He could just tell that this little villain hasn't had genuine praise in quite a long time. Between emotional manipulation and genuine affection, Midoriya couldn't tell what he was receiving at this very moment. It wasn't like he cared, however. When Shigaraki stopped his petting, he hunched over the counter to go through his phone and settings to find his phone number. Midoriya leaned to the side to get a nosy peek at what he was doing and got the hint as to what he was going for. He took his own phone out and went into his contacts. And though he didn't necessarily have to do this to see, he leaned further to the side to press himself into the older villain's arm and shoulder. Just to be against him and put some weight against him as he entered in the phone number. Shigaraki stayed still and let him press against him without a word. He even watched the little villain enter the contact name. For obvious reasons, he wouldn't put Shigaraki Tomura. What if someone saw? He had a better idea. Big Brother. Seeing this made Shigaraki blink a few times and then look away like he never saw it. Embarrassed? Absolutely. But was he going to say anything against it? Absolutely not. Typing that contact name down made Midoriya's smile soften. This name felt just right. Could I see your coat, Midoriya? Kurogiri asked, coming around to the same side of the bar. Without much thought, the teenager did as asked and unzipped his bloody black hoodie and had the man take it. Let me wash it for you before someone catches you outside. And thus he walked off with it, but not without Shigaraki snatching something from his back pocket. When Kurogiri left, he put in his password that he must have learned at some point and went digging to find his number and set it on the counter. He had to get a new number, so I need it too, he said casually. That was not a lie as he put the man's number into his own contacts. But he did peer over at the little villain's screen and saw him name the number Dad and had to cover his mouth to keep from laughing. As dawn drew closer, Midoriya was sent on his way to go back to his mother's home. He waved goodbye and went on his way with a sleepy smile. Tonight was a big step into becoming a villain with Shigaraki as his guide. Never had his heart been filled with so much pride and joy. He was becoming something. He was going to prove everyone wrong. And he was going to make the beautiful boy his. I never took you as the supportive type, Kurogiri commented as he was shining a glass cup. Shigaraki was playing on his phone on his favorite stool and just smirked with a shrug. Never took you as the fatherly type. You're not so tough anymore in your old age, are you? He instigated with his smirk growing to a mischievous grin. The taunt made the man in the suit's glowing yellow eyes narrow. The scrawny troublemaker could be such a brat sometimes. But deep down, he knew he had every right to be. What's that supposed to mean, Shigaraki Tomura? He challenged as he slowly put the glass down on the counter. He wasn't going to fight this young man. There would be no point and he honestly did not want to. But he was willing to put on a show to remind him that he was not some kind of servant. His dark fog body mass began to expand slightly in a small form of intimidation. He put you as Dad on his phone. Shigaraki lightly snickered. What? Kurogiri's body immediately compressed into its normal size and his eyes slightly expanded. His phone. Yes. I gave him your number. I understand. Your contact name is Dad. And thus the dark fog Dad's foggy head went from being a compressed cloud of matter into a misty mess as it expanded unevenly and thinly as a reaction of embarrassment, but also something else. Ha. Shigaraki said and pointed at him as a tease. Izuku. Midoriya's dearest mother cried out from across the house. It wasn't noon yet, but with Midoriya going to bed between 6 and 7 in the morning was too early to wake up. But his mother's cries were enough to make him groan. She wasn't sobbing, just probably in a normal panic. He rolled over in bed and covered his head with his favorite white hoodie that was a bit too big for him. He always slept with it. It was difficult to sleep without it by now. Izuku, wake up. Anko cried out, having come into his room and began frantically shaking him. UA sent you a letter. Your entrance exam is this week. How hopeless she was, still believing that he had dreams for that school. Perhaps he did, but not with the same intentions as before. He couldn't help but feel overwhelming anger at the sound of her tearful excitement, but quickly remembered that this was his mother. She meant no harm. And yet when he hid his face in the hoodie, he immediately remembered. He'll be there. Surely he'll be there. Midoriya sat up and took the letter from his mother's hands as she clung to his shoulders and tried to read it with him. The anticipation was going to give her a heart attack. Her eyes were too full of tears to read it. It's a reminder that the entrance exam is this week. I completely forgot, he mumbled, still sounding beyond exhausted. It wasn't like he dissected a whole human body last night. But he fought the tiredness to read on further. Because I'm quirkless, they're giving me a special test. All but, he gritted his teeth and his grip on the paper tightened. He was still bitter against this society. I won't be able to apply to the hero course. But there are others to choose from. So I won't be taking the hero exam. Not fair. Not fair at all. Even if the school just started allowing quirkless people in, they still banned them from even trying to be heroes. He'll show them. Oh, that sounds wonderful, sweetie. Anko smiled as she wiped her eyes. Had anyone else said that, Midoriya would be more than just furious. But he knew his mother was just scared that he was going to get hurt and was just happy that this school was giving her son some kind of a chance. She meant well. If only she knew. So what are they offering? What's on there? She leaned in a bit to try and get a closer look. Business, investigation, costume support, costume equipment, mass media, agency bull, medical. Midoriya cut her off, staring at another faction of the school. His eyes were locked on the medical support course. I want to do medicine, he repeated. How much more he could learn. How much more he could impress Shigaraki and Kurogiri. The school would be teaching him how to more properly rip people apart. The irony was almost enough to make him burst out laughing. But he had to control himself. Bite his tongue. Play nice with the other kids. That control started at home. He forced a sweet innocent smile to his mother that looked as natural as could be, almost as if his face was glittering with joy. I want to be a doctor. The pure smile of her dearest son was enough to make Oenko tear up again and hug onto him tightly. She was beginning to believe that he finally let go of the hero dream to pursue something just as admirable. His hopes didn't have to be crushed by reality any longer. At least, that's what she was being led to believe. My baby's going to be a doctor. That sounds wonderful, Izuku. I'm so happy, she said so lovingly as Izuku used on hand to keep her embrace close. Yeah. I'm going to save so many people, he said dreamily with his eyes peacefully closed. Going to save him. Over the next couple of days, Midoriya would start leaving just before sundown to go out instead of sneaking out late at night. Without a subject to practice on and to give himself a break from all day studying, he would go out shopping instead. But only kind of. He would casually take pictures of things in department and furniture stores around the city that he liked and send them to Kurogiri. He would also wander into a few electronic stores and take pictures of things to send them to Shigaraki. When school started once again, he imagined that he wouldn't be returning to his mother too often. It would be much more convenient to start living in his new home, with his new family. Now he got to choose anything he wanted without a budget. How easy it was to steal with a teleportation quirk. Midoriya had also found out one night that Shigaraki was incredibly tech-savvy. He watched him one night, with just a laptop at the bar with tons of wires attached to it. He was able to hack into any store the little villain had gone into and temporarily turn off security cameras. Long enough to let Kurogiri steal things from inventory rooms, but short enough to make it look like a glitch or malfunction. It impressed the boy and made him look up to Shigaraki even more. Of course, the latter let it fill his ego just a little bit more. By the end of the week, Midoriya was able to decorate his apartment space in any way he wanted. No longer was his room forced to remain tainted with All Might merchandise. Instead, the walls were clean and more mature. His color preference had changed as much of his furniture was black and decorations were kept monochrome colors except for the occasional dash of red. On the night before the exam, much of his personal things have been moved into. Clothes filled the drawers. Books filled his shelves. His bathroom was set for his own needs. This was going to be home very soon. Shigaraki would find Midoriya sitting on his bed and holding the special white hoodie close to himself. He's even brought something as important as that with him. As of that moment, he appeared to be daydreaming while staring out the window at the twinkling city lights outside. With the lights off, they made the room more colorful and provided the perfect atmosphere to stop thinking for once. To keep from rudely disturbing him, Shigaraki sat down at the foot of the bed and would stay there silently for at least a few minutes. He would look around at the newly decorated space and just enjoy a silent moment with the younger villain, letting him have a moment to think to himself. Do you really think he'll be there? Midoriya asked quietly. He had acknowledged the other presence in the room by now but did not make eye contact with him, too focused on the lights coming from outside. Yeah, it would make sense, the other responded with a shrug. Was it something he was really worried about? This guy he only met for a fraction of a day seemed to be on his mind quite often. He teased him about having a crush on him dozens of times by now, but was the denial out of embarrassment or confusion? Tomu, Midoriya began to say something but paused as he hugged the white hoodie closer to his nose. The sound of that terrible nickname made the killer at the foot of the bed blush and show a grumpy expression. How degrading. Some big bad villain he was for letting this teenager call him something as demeaning as that. If I did like him, would that be okay? What do you mean? You talk about him all the time so clearly, you don't hate him. No, not like that. The question made Shigaraki think for a moment. Was Midoriya admitting to having a crush on this mysterious boy after all? Or was he trying to figure that part out still? Something that he had to keep in mind was that this little villain was still growing up. Still learning about the world, but also himself. Still figuring things out. So you're asking me that, if you actually did have a crush on him, would I allow it? Shigaraki tried to clarify. Allow it as a leader for his underling to have romantic feelings? Or allow him to have romantic feelings for a boy, period? Like, I'm just confused. I've never really had friends or anything like that. So I don't know what I'm feeling. Feelings. Such terribly confusing things. I don't know if it's a crush, or looking forward to having a real friend. I get so nervous when I think about seeing him again. But maybe it's just because I tried to do something stupid the first second he met me. He probably thinks I'm so weird. Maybe he'll never want to talk to me again. Or maybe he's changed over the summer. What if he's not the same person? What if his father got to him and completely changed his personality? What if I'm just getting my hopes up just to be destroyed again? Midoriya would find himself amid an anxious ramble, not noticing that he had begun to scratch at his wrists subconsciously. It wasn't until Shigaraki grabbed his wrist with a pinky up and pulled it away. What are you really worried about, Izuku? Midoriya froze when he felt his wrist be pulled away and suddenly realized the subtle burning sensation from his nails digging into his skin. He had picked up such horrible habits. Shigaraki's hand easily gripped his wrist firmly from how skinny he was. His anxiety was branching into self-harming habits just like the one he looked up to. But he would never blame the one as he saw as a big brother for it. Right now, that person was trying to understand what was giving him all this anxiety. What was he truly scared of? If these are romantic feelings for another boy, are you going to be angry? Would Shigaraki approve of such a relationship? It would seem odd but not odd for a villain such as him, filled with hatred and bitterness, to disapprove of things like that. But even as a villain, a killer, maybe a monster, he was not without heart. Here he was at that moment, keeping his new little brother from falling too deep into self-harm. I don't really get that stuff. If you're asking me if I'm going to kill you for liking some guy, the answer is number. I'm not like that. That stuff is already. He paused for a second and his face nearly cringed thinking about it. It's so gross. He had the mentality of a child. Anything romantic was just disgusting to him. People's lips touching, how revolting. The answer was enough to make Midoriya get a tiny bit emotional as he bit his lower lip and, with the hoodie still in his grasp, hugged Shigaraki's skinny torso. The reaction made the older villain lose all color once again as his soul yeeted out of existence for a short time frame. The little teenager smiled as he hugged on tight to the limp body of his makeshift big brother. Thanks, Tomu, for everything, he said sappily. Kill me, was all the other could wheeze out. This kid was going to be the death of him. What a gruesome chapter this was. Anyway, I very much hope you enjoyed and I hope I see you guys again tomorrow. Shout out to my first subscriber and as the meme gods always say, be gay and do crime. Storyteller signing off.